All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Jasmine. All right, so like Jasmine said, we're going to go over deadline chains and task flows, which are two of my favorite things. Um, First thing to think about when you're thinking about deadline chains as task flows is how are they different? The main thing that's different about deadline chains and task flows is how they're triggered. Deadline chains are triggered by traveling into the deadline chains section, which is a built-in section in Filevine, and triggering that chain that you've created on the back end. And we'll go through how to create a chain, best practices, and those kinds of things. And task flows are triggered by phase changes over here or triggering an action button, which I've got one just right here. Um, so let's talk about task flows first. Um, First thing with task flows is, as I mentioned, they can be triggered by a phase change or an action button. And trying to determine which one to use for a task flow. So keep that in mind. Phase change task flows are perfect for things that are going to occur on every case. So for instance, maybe you've got a file setup that needs to occur on every single case you have. Doesn't matter the case type, doesn't matter if it's MBA, premises, it doesn't matter. You've got to print off a label, maybe if you still have physical files, or, contact the client and get further details from that intake, then that's kind of something you'd want to make a phase-based task. And then action buttons work great for things that either occur throughout any point in the case. Maybe it's not an intake, maybe it can happen at any time. A prime example is, medical records requests. If you do those in-house, for those of you that practice personal injury, as we know, those medical records, they can occur at any time throughout the case. I mean, you can be in the middle of a depot and find out that a client has a medical provider they didn't tell you about in discovery or even early on, and you have to come back and request records. That's something that's great for an action button. Even something that doesn't occur in all case types. Maybe you have a specific task flow for cases that have minors. That's another good example to use an action button that you can place maybe in the intake area or wherever you have that indicator that, oh, this is like a minor, here's a task flow that needs to occur. Let's trigger that. The action button placement are usually great where that data lives, something that makes sense with the workflow for your staff to see. So let's kind of take a look at how they work, how to build them, the different types of tasks as well. So I've already built just a few for us to look at, and then we can build some together as well. So for instance, I would put one in a treating phase, and this one is actually a repeating task. And that's usually my favorite scenario to use a repeating task is for client contact. Maybe you want to have a repeating task just in that treating phase. For example, again, in personal injury, that's usually when we lose contact with the client a lot when they're treating, and you want to make sure there's not gaps in treatment and things like that. So you want to set up that repeating task. What that looks like in the back end, you come into task flows, make sure you select phases. We're going to look at my treating phase here in this task that I created. To create a repeating task that is phase-based, you have to make sure that the trigger is for when the phase changes. It cannot be for when another auto task is completed. It can't be the contingency. It's got to be when that phase changes. And then keep in mind, this part right here is super important on how often it populates. And I usually recommend when it's a client contact repeating task to go ahead, have it create immediately, and then have it do however far out you need it due. So for example, if you're doing a 30-day, every 30-day check-in to the client for treatment, or 60, or even in litigation, you can set one up in litigation just to contact them every 90 days, let them know what's going on, what stage you're at in litigation. You want to put that here. And the reason I say create immediately is because the client can call in anytime between now and that 90 days. And if this task isn't creating till 90 days to be due, like that same day, then that takes away that autonomy for your staff to be able to complete that task. whenever they may call. So that's why I always recommend kind of making it create immediately. And let's say we do that 30 again. And then I have it repeat every 1 day. So let me talk about this because this took me a little bit to kind of figure out when I was creating this as a paralegal myself. So what happens is as soon as this task is completed, it will actually trigger tomorrow to be due in another 30 days. And again, that's just going to kind of give you that autonomy for when that client calls in to be able to complete it whenever that may be. So we all know that there's some clients that are just kind of frequent flyers. They call in all the time. So this lets you be able to, kind of complete that task. But if something should happen to where, they don't call in for 30 days, then you still have this task as a fall through to make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks. It kind of helps prevent bottlenecks in your cases as well. So another helpful thing to do, because this can drive staff crazy, that if they're like, oh, I completed this task yesterday and here it is again, I will sometimes just add a little instruction text into text as well, the task text, where I will say, this is a repeating task that will re-trigger the next day once completed. And this just kind of lets your staff know. So, and I also like to do font codes. So let me, I'll show you, and we'll also share this link as well. This is formatting codes that let you format your text in your tasks. So when I save here, you'll see what I mean. So it kind of gives you a different format that draws the attention to the instructions at the bottom of the task. And this is coding that you can use in tasks, you can use in your activity feed here, and you can also use it in instruction fields in your sections itself. Again, it just makes it easier visually, especially when you're providing instructions to your staff. And then when you have a lot of content or data, breaking it out like that will be available.
I went ahead and put the support article for that formatting in the chat so that if you all would like to bookmark that page, I know I usually do. Yes. That's a great page to have bookmarked. And yes, this recording will be available to rewatch on our website. I'll also include that link or like landing page on here. It usually takes at least a few days for us to get it uploaded. So if you don't see it right after this, just know that we are working to upload it.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. All right. All right, another quick question is how it relates to having tasks assigned to a particular role, and that specific role is not assigned on a particular case. Defaults to assigning attorney to task. Any way to set up secondary so it does not dump to attorney. So the reason it is going to your attorney is because anytime you don't have a role assigned in Filevine on a project, it's going to go directly to your primary. Sometimes I see firms actually use their case managers or paralegals as their primary because that's really the only reason to have that primary is that it's kind of a catch-all person. So if they're really managing tasks, then you may want to look at actually having a case manager or paralegal be assigned as your primary in Filevine role.
And if you don't know how to like do that role setup or change it, we can walk you through that if you need help on that at the end. And then it looks like, can I create a task flow page through the customs editor? Is the next question, Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually have something kind of set up. So in theory, you can have a task flow page. If you wanted to have a page with action buttons, you can do that. Another thing that I do that I've recommended, which is actually what I was going to kind of get into next, so great segue, is I have for clients that have a process in their like file setup or something that has a bunch of tasks where they don't want to over inundate their staff with a task after task after task. So for example, file setup, as we all know, there's, you've got to make sure the retainer scanned. You've got to also make sure you got HIPAAs, all sorts of stuff, order police report. So it can be pretty lengthy. And if you have a task for every single one of those items, it can get really intense. So what I sometimes do is actually utilize the multi-select list and create a checklist, if you will. And I create one task that says, hey, complete this file setup checklist. And I include a link in the task. And then your staff can kind of come in here and check it off as they're completing the task and saving it. And let me show you. And here it is. Here's the task I actually create ahead of time. So we can look at what it looks like. So they can, and I did a URL link here, which again is in the format codes, and I'll show you what that code looks like in the back end. But that lets the staff so they can travel to it from that page, go directly into the intake section so they know they're not having to dig and look for the checklist. And then I think it's just running a little slow today, so we won't wait on it. And then again, I added that instruction text here that says, hey, don't complete this task until the checklist itself is complete. And then your staff can actually come in here and actually say like, hey, call police department. So just kind of put updates here. Stated PR would be ready on Monday. And then they can add updates to what they're doing on that checklist to the task thread itself. This also will pop up if you're running a report and you add last activity to the task to your incomplete task report. So you can see, okay, well, they've not completed this task yet, but it looks like they just did an activity on this task yesterday. So they are working on it. But long answer to your question is yes, you can create a page, but it would be action buttons or utilizing something similar, like a file setup checklist. And I've actually seen some people create a section that has checklists for each phase that they may have in a section. So that is something to do as well. All right, so let me show you the URL link here in the backend. You'll see that formatting code with the brackets and then the URL you want in parentheses here. And also another thing you can do in your task is you can actually hit our question mark here up here, and you can find those replacement field lists, and you can actually use replacement codes that you use in document generation and things like that in Taskflows. So let's do one in our treating where it says contact client. I'm going to hit this question mark, pull up our replacement fields, just like we would as if we were doing coding a doc gen. And now I'm going to look for that client phone. So maybe I want that client's phone number, contact client at retrievement status. So now when this task triggers, it will pull in that client's phone number in the task. So your staff's not having to look for it. So let's see if I can plug in a quick phone number for us and get a trigger so you guys can see how that works. And I'm gonna complete our task and then re-trigger it. See if it'll re-trigger for us today. Yep, and now you'll see contact client at, and it pulls in that phone number here for treatment status. So again, it just adds just a little more information in the task flow that would help a staff member. Another thing that I've done is pull in dates too. So if you have an important date that needs to be pulled out of a section into a task, you can do that as well. Just keep in mind the same restrictions that are in collection sections kind of apply here as well, unless you're utilizing an action button. So let's go into triggering a task flow in an action button. I've got that one here in our med section that I've created. And so you still have the same thing. You can still create a task that is triggered by clicking on the action button itself. And then of course, when you can create when another auto task is completed as well. And also keep in mind when you're building the task, they don't have to be one after the other. It's not completely linear. You can even have like a tree, or you can have 5 tasks all trigger at the same time when you click a button or change a phase. And then now we have, and you can also use a repeating task as well. So same thing with the phases is the repeating task has to be triggered by when that request medical records has been activated. So you can click repeat task here. Same concept as before. I will tell you to keep in mind when you're doing repeating tasks in an action button, you're going to want to be careful. The action buttons, the only way to get them to stop those repeating tasks is when you reset. And if you don't give project admin permissions to your staff on their cases, then they're not going to be able to reset that button. So then this task is just going to repeat until the case is over. So do keep that in mind. So I usually don't recommend using the repeating task unless it is in a phase. I usually don't recommend it for action buttons. If you're not sure about how to trigger an action button, let's take a look at that and reset. I'll show you that as well. You can click here. It's going to start the task flow. What's great about the action buttons too, it's going to say who activated it and at what day and time. There's been times where I've gone back into a project and been like, oh, did I activate this? And took a look. Oh, yeah, there it goes. I did. And here's that reset. Because I'm a project admin on this case, I have the permissions to be able to do this. If you have staff that are working in your cases that are only collaborators, they don't have admin status, they're not going to be able to reset. So keep that in mind again when you're doing any task flow builds that does have a repeating in that action button. You click reset and that resets the task flow there, and then you can retrigger it as needed. All right. And that is action buttons. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're using an action button in a collection section, what's great is that you can pull in data from that specific collection item. So for example, I did that here when I said send request to meds provider name. I'm using the field code selector to pull in send request to lean test. That was the contact we had. So it's pulling in that full name. So that again, for med specifically, will help staff know, okay, I know what provider I need to request from. I can travel to the collection item and make sure I get that medical request out. All right. That's kind of the basics on task flow and just some little tips and tricks that you can do. And of course, and once you do task flows, it's also good to have an incomplete task report as well to go with it. I do recommend those. And then there's always manual tasking. So just quick manual tasking that you can do in-house too for any one-off tasks that need to occur on cases. You can hit your at button here and you can task your coworkers, client call, please follow up. And you can actually use our little asterisk here to change the due date. Actually, I think it needs to be Friday. And then it'll make it due on Friday. So anytime you're doing anything in the activity feed and you're not sure if you're doing it right, clicking the right button, if you travel down here right next to before you create it, and it's telling you exactly what you're doing. Hey, this is going to be a task for Derek that follow up with this client on Friday. Put that here. And then you can add any tags. I do recommend tags for anything, for any kind of client contact. It makes it easier to track your client contact if you use a tag. Client contact, there's a lot of reporting things you can do with those tags, especially if you're trying to figure out on cases you haven't contacted clients recently on. Create our task here. And there we've got our manual task. You can reassign to another user here just by clicking, or like I can assign it back to myself just by doing assign it back to myself. You can also do it by clicking assign to. I usually recommend that users reassign by adding to the conversation because that just adds a historical view. Like, hey, on this day, I assigned it to this user, and even adding notes in there as to why. Same thing for changing due dates. I always recommend that if you're training your staff on tasking, that they make sure they put into the notes they're changed the due date from this date to this date and why. Otherwise, it's just kind of covering and again just adding that historical view to the task. You can also when you're tasking, you can also include documents in your task. So you've got your add attachment here, and it'll pull up a document. So if you need to task an attorney or your paralegal, like, hey, maybe you made edits to a pleading, you need your paralegal to review it, your edits, and then print it off and send it to the client. You can actually attach a document that is already in Filevine just by clicking add attachment and then tasking that user here. So I'll task Jasmine. Please review. So I'm not pulling in a new document. It's still the same document that's in there. So you're not having to re-download another document or create different versions that you don't need to. You can literally just attach a document you've already been working on and you're just bringing it to somebody's attention in the activity feed. And then she can travel in here by hitting the caret and actually taking a look at it and opening. She could rename it if she wanted to from this screen and then actually just open it from here and start making edits. All right. So that's kind of the basics on Taskflow as a whole. We went over kind of manual tasking, phase-based tasking, and button tasking. Now we can dive into deadline chains, since I'm not seeing any questions just yet. All right, deadline chains are great for anything. There they are. Anything that is going to have hard deadlines. So, for example, I've seen a couple where you have very specific case management orders that are in a certain court that are always going to be the same every time you get a trial or a trial order. I know it's different in every state. These deadline chains are great for things like this. So, for example, here where I live, there is a specific county that every time we have a docket sounding, that trial set, we have to file a scheduling order. It's exactly the same every time. So as soon as you plug in that trial date, and then there's all experts are due this date, it's exactly the same every time. So deadline chains are great for that. I've also done deadline chains for something service, anything that has a hard deadline, and you can also include internal deadlines in deadline chains. They don't all have to be external court dates. If there's something that you want to create a hard deadline internally in your firm just to make sure things get done, you can build that into your deadline chain as well. So here's one that I've built before. It's kind of, it's a good example. It's something that's based off of a trial date. So as soon as we get that trial date out here, it's going to actually trigger your deadlines that are associated with that trial date. And what's a good thing? A good thing to take a look at on the deadline chains is that it does go on the calendar for the project. And as long as you're subscribed to the project, it will also go on your user calendar as well. So this helps you keep up with these deadlines. And we'll take a look at it in the back end as well, but let's take a look at what it looks like on a calendar. I like to pop over and take a look at the list view. This lets me know all the deadlines on here that I can take a look at. It lets me know which chain is in here. And another thing that you can do with deadline chains, oops, I keep going to that one, It's deadline chains is you could actually trigger a chain, more than one chain at a time. So for example, if you were using it for discovery or for ants, you know, hey, we filed a lawsuit or answers, you're trying to track service or answers, and you have more than one defendant, then you can trigger more than one chain at a time. So if I wanted to rename this as for a trial for one, you know, for a different defendant, for whatever reason it's not consolidated, you get to, you know, whatever it may be, you can put it in here, just rename it, and then you can trigger another one. And just make it a little further out here, and then rename it here. And I'll show you what this looks like on the calendar. So now we've got our different names, and you can toggle between the two right here. So by renaming it, it helps you keep it organized, keep your dates organized, and then when you travel to the calendar, it's going to tell you, hey, this is for this defendant, and hey, this deadline is for this defendant. And then if you've never used deadline chains before, when you complete a deadline here, it's going to populate on your calendar that has been completed in, I don't remember which date that was. Oh, that's May of next year. Back to our calendar here. May, and it'll populate with a little done right here. It also will staff the reminders. So that's another thing I will get into as well is reminder schedules. I won't dive too deep into reminder schedules, but anytime you're talking about deadlines, you do want to think about reminder schedules and how you're being notified of those deadlines. Because with reminder schedules, you do have full control over how many times you're getting those reminders, even after it's overdue, if you still want to get reminders, those kinds of things. So you have that done. So it doesn't come off the calendar, but you do have in parentheses on it that it is done. So that deadline has been satisfied. And those are just kind of little helpful things that you can do with the deadline chain. So let's take a look at it in the back end here. So if you've never built a deadline chain before, let's see here. Go. Your chain. So when you're building a deadline chain, you add a new and you actually, it will default first will be unpublished. What unpublished means is that no one can create a new deadline chain with it because you haven't published it to the org yet. So you want to leave it unpublished while you're working on it so nobody uses it, and because maybe it's not complete yet or not correct. You also can edit the chain itself by renaming the chain. You also have your calendar here. You can create different judicial calendars. Maybe there's a holiday that needs to be included in there that's specific to a judicial district, anything like that. But by default, it's going to be count every day. Then you can add jurisdictions in here if you want to indicate that this chain is for a specific jurisdiction. You can input that in there. And then you can also put any little URL in here. So maybe this is something that's specific to a local rules to a certain court. You can add a link to that local rules. It's something that's helpful. I think you'll see it's right here. So something that your staff can reference. It's helpful. And then you've got like any internal notes for the chain you can put in here as well. And then of course you can hit the pencil here just to rename it. And then you can export a deadline chain. Maybe there's a couple of you that have more than one org and you want to export the chain, you can do that. Publish. And now the first thing you want to do when you have a deadline chain is you want to create that parent deadline or anchor date. So it's going to be the deadline that you receive that triggers everything. So it's going to anchor the chain. So for example, that's going to be this trial date here. It's not dependent on another deadline because it's the leader essentially. And when you're creating that parent date, you have options here. You can actually, there are options to hide it in the calendars. I have some clients that want to have some dates on the calendar and others, they just want reminders and they don't want them on the calendars because they don't want their calendars to get really junked up. then you can hide a date at a time. Say, oh, I do want the trial day, but I don't really care about when the experts must be demanded. Let's hide that off the calendar. Then you can do that. This does affect it on all cases, so do keep that in mind when you're using it on a deadline chain and you're hiding dates, that it's not case specific. It affects the whole chain for anybody that's using it. And here's that reminder schedule I was mentioning. This is where you assign that reminder schedule, and you can assign a different reminder schedule to each deadline you have in here. So maybe the trial date is usually going to be the furthest out. So maybe you need a reminder schedule that has more deadlines than you would for something that's like, oh, this is just 30 days after the case is filed. You probably don't need something that has a 120-day reminder. I did click on the reminder schedules, which are right here in your advanced menu. You can create as many as you'd like in here. But most of you, if you haven't ever done reminder schedules before, you will have a Filevine default reminder schedule, which is actually pretty aggressive. So if you're ever having an issue with your feed, you're getting too many reminders, take a look at your reminder schedule. That's going to be the culprit of those many reminders. And just start updating them. You can come in here and create something like this. It's just 50, 20, 90, 60, 30, 20, 10 on due date itself. And then just a couple days after. I have some clients that don't like the overdue. And then of course, I think the Filevine default has like 10, 9, 8, like every day until the actual due date once you hit 10. And that can be pretty aggressive, especially if it's something that is a court deadlines. So you can create as many as you want in here. You'll see that a lot of people are including the actual reminder cadence in here in the name. This is helpful so you know what you're selecting. You can also name it for what you're using it for. So for example, if this is specific to a trial, this is my trial reminder schedule. I'm going to add that here. Whatever internally makes sense for you guys. So, if you have other admins that are working in here, then they know which reminder schedule to use for what type of deadline. I have some clients that create a reminder schedules for statutes, and that's what the reminder schedule they use just for statutes. And this is one they use for motions, things like that you can do when you're naming reminder schedules as well. And to add a date to your reminder schedule, you come in here and you can do like, 190. And this is where you select, is it before due date, after due date, or on due date? Like we want to add 190 before, we click plus, and there it is. And then to delete, you just hit the X. And it will automatically be saved. And then you can favor a reminder schedule, and that just will bring it up to the top, or just makes it that org default. All right, so that is the reminder schedule. So now we'll go back to our chain. So now that gives you a little bit more knowledge on when you're creating the deadline chains and how you're getting your notifications and your reminders. So and the frequency. So now you have your parent. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just a note, you do have to be subscribed in order to get reminders on a project. So if you your general settings are unsubscribed, you'll want to make sure that you go into that role setup or team section, whatever you've called it, and make sure that you're actually subscribed so that you can get those notifications.
Yep, great point, Jasmine. And to do that, you travel to team. And again, you have to be a project admin to make any changes in a team section on a case basis. You make your selection here, click on our member.
If you click on the members tab next to roles at the top.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, they've changed the team section. So some of you may not look like this. Some may still be in the old view. If it's in the old view, it's a little bit easier to find. There's not two different tabs. This new view does have multiple tabs and the ability for you to kind of change those items around.
Thank you, Jasmine. Yes, and then in members, or if it's the old way, it won't quite look like this, but you'll just make that selection of the user you're wanting to change, and then you'll just toggle on that subscribed, and that's how you make sure you're getting those reminders. And now that you've got your reminder schedule set up. You've got to make sure that you're subscribed in the cases you're wanting to get these reminders. You can build your chain here. So you've got your parent deadline here, and then you have, this is when you start building the chain itself. So we've got our experts must be demanded, and it's going to be dependent on another deadline. And this is when you still make a selection of which deadline it is. So this is going to be dependent on trial date. So this deadline is 70 days before the trial date is due. So this is when it gets kind of tricky. If you have something like a trial date where most of the deadlines are going to be before, you're going to want to make sure you select earlier. By default, it does fall on later. So when you're building these chains, pay attention to this area. This is where it will get tricky, and everybody does it every once in a while, where you're like, oh, I forgot to select earlier, so one of your deadlines are falling behind the due date. So do keep that in mind. And then again, you have an area where you can select your reminder schedule. And then you can add notes in here too. So if you had notes that you want to give instructions to your staff, it does populate on your chain next in a little eye. You do have to hover over it to make those notes populate, but it does show up in the chain. Then you can click select save. You can also organize these how you want to see them. You can do that. And that's just for visual purposes in the back end where it will help you make sense of it. And then you can also, when you're doing the chain, if you have some deadlines that trigger off of another deadline and not the parent date, you can do that as well. So you can, again, make that selection dependent on another deadline and then select which deadline it is and gets a due date. You can also build off of a completed date. So for example, if you have, if you're doing a chain for service and you want to add that the answer is due 30 days after they've been served, and then service is after the filing, then you can do that. So file date, and then you can do completed for when that service has been completed. You can do that here as well. Then this is going to share the same deadline because it's due 0 days later. So it's going to essentially share that same deadline date here. And sometimes I recommend, when I've had clients before that create really complicated deadline chains and they've gotten really kind of stuck and gotten around in circles, you can create a chart if you wanted to, a flow chart separately before you really start getting in here. If you're wanting to, if you're a visual person, I myself am a pretty visual person, so something like that would help me. I know I want this to trigger here, so you can also build a flow chart before you get in here if you're going to do something complicated. The flowchart also works well for Taskflows as well too. So again, if you're a more visual person and you're wanting to build something that's really complex, take a step back, put it on paper or even on a spreadsheet. Sometimes that's helpful too. Some of my clients do that as well before we start really building a Taskflow. They like to put it on paper, make sure they're not missing anything in the flow of their cases. Another thing, I know we've kind of talked about deadline chains and task flows being completely separate. Sometimes I've seen some clients create a task flow to trigger a deadline chain. So if you can create a task, add a link to the deadline chain with instructions like, hey, this is when you trigger the SOL deadline chain, something like that. You can do that. That's a way to kind of tie them both in together if you're going to be utilizing both. And then the final thing you've got down here in chains, this is what is called a group. So this is when the group is completed when one of the following deadlines gets completed. So this is kind of when you have a branch of like 3 options. So for example, this is motion in limine. This is when you can either have a motion in limine be completed personally or by mail. So if you've got something that needs to be completed and then they have 3 options to complete it, that's when you can use a group, and they can make that selection of which deadline they did complete, and it completes the whole group. All right, and that is deadline chains. And pop in. I don't see any questions so far, but that is really it as far as deadline chains. Does anybody have any questions they want to pop in the Q&A? I tried to wrap it up so we could have just kind of an open Q&A if anybody had any issues about really just anything Filevine related.
While we kind of wait for stuff to pop in, if folks have it, those deadline chains do pop up on the calendar. So if you do run multiple deadline chains, and maybe you're running the same one, but for different people or different instances, you'll want to make sure that you like specify in that title, kind of what it's for. That way, you know which deadline specifically or which deadline chain it's specifically related to, because it will tell you in the description there. So just to note, again, does calendar in the calendar section for you all to be able to see that in there. Perfect. I thank you so much, Amy. You did a great job.
Thank
If
you.
you all do end up having questions, I put both Amy and my email in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out. We can help out kind of again with any of our services, or direct you in the correct way or place. I did also include the training videos, the link to our training videos. We do record these free help sessions, so that's where it will be once we get it uploaded. We do have other videos on there, so if you're wanting more info on QuickBooks or FEDA or kind of lead docket or any of those things, we do have them there. We also do have a lead docket webinar, so if you are subscribed to our newsletter, you should have gotten an update this morning about that webinar. I believe it's right after this. So if you have lead docket and you want to kind of get more insight on that, definitely feel free to join us for that. But if not, thank you so much for hanging out with us today, and we hope to see you again on another free help. Perfect. Thanks so much, Amy.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.